He thought firing her would end everything, but in less than 5 minutes, the entire room would realize he had just made the worst mistake of his career. The marble floors of the Grand Meridian Hotel reflected the chandelier light like a polished mirror, every step echoing just loud enough to remind people they were standing somewhere expensive, somewhere powerful, somewhere that didn't tolerate mistakes, especially not from someone like Naomi Carter, who now stood in the center of the lobby with her housekeeping cart still beside her, her fingers trembling slightly against the cold metal handle as the words, "You're done here," hung in the air, heavier than the scent of polished wood and imported perfume. And for a moment, no one moved. Not the guests sipping their afternoon drinks, not the concierge pretending to reorganize papers, not even the security guard who had already taken one step closer as if waiting for confirmation, because everyone understood what this moment was. Not just a termination, but a display, a message wrapped in humiliation, carefully delivered in public so it would echo longer. And Naomi felt every pair of eyes on her, measuring her, judging her, deciding whether she deserved it. And yet she didn't look down. Not this time. Not like she had done so many times before, because something in her had shifted the second she spoke up 10 minutes earlier when she heard the raised voice near the service hallway, when she saw her co-worker being cornered, accused, talked over, dismissed like she didn't matter, and Naomi had stepped in, her voice calm but firm, asking a simple question that no one else had dared to ask. And that had been enough. Enough to cross a line she hadn't even known existed, because in places like this, silence was expected, obedience was rewarded, and dignity was optional. And the manager, Richard Hale, stood a few feet away now, his posture straight, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression carrying that practiced mixture of annoyance and superiority, like a man who had done this before and would do it again. And he let out a quiet sigh, as if Naomi's presence alone was an inconvenience he had to endure. "You should have stayed in your place," he said, not raising his voice, not needing to, because the calmness made it sharper, made it cut deeper, and a few guests nearby exchanged glances, some curious, some uncomfortable, but none of them stepped in, because this wasn't their problem. And Naomi slowly removed the small name tag pinned to her uniform, her movements deliberate, controlled, as if she refused to let the moment rush her, refused to let him see her break. And when she finally looked up, her eyes met his without hesitation, steady, grounded, and for a brief second, something flickered across his face, something he quickly buried under authority. "Security will escort you out," he added, already turning away as if the situation had resolved itself, as if she no longer existed. And that was when the silence in the lobby changed. Not louder, not obvious, just different, like a shift in the air pressure before a storm, subtle but undeniable, because near the far corner of the room, where the leather chairs met the shadow of a towering column, a man who had been sitting quietly for the last 15 minutes finally set his glass down, the faint sound of crystal touching marble barely audible, yet somehow enough to draw attention. And he didn't rush, didn't announce himself, just stood, adjusting the cuff of his dark suit with a precision that spoke of habit, of control, of someone who never moved without purpose. And as he took his first step forward, a few heads turned instinctively, not recognizing him yet, but sensing something different in the way he carried himself, the kind of presence that didn't need introduction, the kind that made people straighten their posture without knowing why. And Naomi didn't notice him at first. Her focus still locked on the reality unfolding in front of her, the job she needed, the paycheck that kept her apartment, the fragile balance of a life built paycheck to paycheck now slipping through her fingers. But then she heard it, not loud, not aggressive, just a single sentence delivered with quiet authority that cut through everything else. Hold on. And the word didn't echo, didn't demand attention. It simply took it. And Richard paused mid-step, his shoulders tightening ever so slightly before he turned back, irritation already forming on his face as if ready to dismiss another interruption. But when his eyes landed on the man walking toward them, that irritation faltered. Just for a second, just long enough to reveal something underneath, something closer to uncertainty. Because the man approaching wasn't dressed louder, wasn't surrounded by guards, wasn't making a scene, and yet every step he took seemed to shift the balance of the room. Like the rules everyone thought they understood were quietly being rewritten. And Naomi felt it too now, that change, that subtle pull of attention away from her and toward him. And for the first time since the words, "You're fired," were spoken. The weight in her chest paused, suspended in that strange moment where something unexpected was about to happen. And no one in the room could quite explain why they suddenly couldn't look away. Richard Hale forced a thin smile that did not quite reach his eyes, the kind of expression used to maintain control when something unexpected threatened to disrupt the script, and he straightened his tie with a quick, almost reflexive motion before speaking. "I am handling a personnel issue, sir. If you would please give us a moment." His tone polite on the surface, but edged with impatience underneath, as if he expected compliance simply because that was how things usually worked. But the man did not slow down, did not redirect, did not acknowledge the dismissal at all, instead continuing forward until the space between them disappeared and the air itself seemed to tighten. And up close, the details became impossible to ignore. The precision of his tailored black suit, the quiet confidence in the way he held his shoulders, the stillness in his gaze that suggested he was not reacting but evaluating. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, carrying just enough weight to silence the faint murmur that had started to ripple through the lobby. "You said she is fired," he repeated, not as a question, but as a statement that demanded confirmation. And Richard let out a small breath, already nodding, eager to re-establish authority. "Yes, that is correct. She violated protocol and caused a disruption in front of guests." And a few heads turned again toward Naomi, curiosity sharpening as the story was reframed, because in places like this, the narrative always mattered more than the truth. And Naomi felt it, the shift, the subtle attempt to define her as the problem, to reduce everything she had done to a single word, disruption. But before she could speak, before she could defend herself again, the man tilted his head slightly, his eyes flicking towards her for the first time. Not dismissive, not judgmental, simply observing, as if taking in the entire situation in one glance. And then he looked back at Richard. "What exactly did she say?" he asked, and there was something about the way he phrased it, calm but precise, that made the question feel heavier than it should have been. And Richard hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, a pause so small most people would not have noticed, but it was there, a crack in the confidence he had been projecting. And he cleared his throat quickly. "It does not matter what she said. What matters is that she stepped out of line and interfered with management." And the man's expression did not change, did not harden or soften. It simply remained steady, unreadable. "I asked what she said," he repeated, and this time the silence that followed was not passive. It was deliberate, stretching just long enough to force attention, to make every person within earshot lean in without realizing it. And Naomi felt her heartbeat slow in a strange, unfamiliar way, not because the situation had improved, but because something about this moment felt different from anything she had experienced before, like the usual rules no longer applied, And Richard's jaw tightened slightly as he glanced around, aware now of the audience, aware that this was no longer a controlled interaction. "She questioned my decision in front of staff," he said, finally, choosing his words carefully. "She made it clear that she did not respect authority." And a faint murmur moved through the guests again, a predictable reaction to the idea of order being challenged, and the man nodded once, slowly, as if processing the statement. Then his gaze shifted back to Naomi, and for the first time since this began, she felt truly seen. Not as a problem, not as an inconvenience, but as a person whose presence actually mattered in the conversation. And he held that look for a moment before asking, "Did you?" And the question was simple, almost quiet, but it landed with a weight that made everything else fade. And Naomi hesitated, not out of fear but out of calculation, because she understood what was being asked was not just about what happened 10 minutes ago. It was about whether she was willing to stand by it now, in front of everyone, knowing what it had already cost her. And her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her uniform before she lifted her chin just enough to meet his gaze fully. "I spoke up," she said, her voice steady despite the pressure building around her, because someone was being treated unfairly. And the words hung there, unembellished, unapologetic. And Richard let out a short, incredulous laugh, stepping forward as if to regain control. "Unfairly," he repeated. "This is exactly the kind of behavior I am talking about, creating unnecessary conflict, undermining management. This is not a place for personal opinions." And he gestured vaguely toward the lobby, toward the polished floors and expensive decor, as if the environment itself justified his stance, as if luxury erased responsibility. But the man did not react to the interruption, did not acknowledge the raised voice, instead keeping his attention on Naomi for one more second before finally shifting back to Richard. And when he spoke again, his tone had not changed. Still calm, still measured, but there was something else beneath it now, something sharper, something that made the room feel even quieter than before. "So she spoke," he said, almost thoughtfully, "and for that, you decided she should not work here anymore." And Richard nodded quickly, seizing the chance to finalize the narrative. "Exactly. We maintain standards here." And the man's lips pressed together briefly. Not quite a smile, not quite disapproval, just a pause. And then he asked one more question, softer than the others, but somehow more dangerous. "Standards," he repeated, "or silence?" And the words settled into the space between them like something that could not be taken back. And for the first time since this began, Richard did not have an immediate answer, and the room, once filled with quiet background noise, now felt completely still. Every guest, every staff member, every passing second suspended in that fragile moment where the balance had shifted, even if no one had said it out loud yet. The question did not need to be repeated because it was already echoing in every corner of the lobby, settling into the polished marble and hanging in the still air like something too heavy to ignore. And Richard Hale felt it, the shift, the way the attention had slipped from his control without warning. And for the first time since he had spoken those confident, dismissive words, his posture tightened not out of authority, but out of calculation, as if he was trying to decide how to recover a situation that no longer followed his script. "We enforce professional conduct," he said finally, his voice firmer now, attempting to reclaim ground that was already slipping. "Employees are expected to follow direction, not challenge it in front of guests." And he gestured again toward the surrounding lobby, toward the quiet observers who had now fully committed their attention to the unfolding moment. Their conversations paused, their drinks untouched. because something more compelling than routine had taken over, and the man standing across from him did not interrupt, did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply listened. And somehow that silence carried more pressure than any confrontation could have, because it forced Richard to continue, to explain, to justify, and the more he spoke, the more the explanation seemed to stretch thin. "This establishment has a reputation," Richard added, almost defensively now, "and we cannot allow behavior that undermines order." And Naomi stood there, her name tag still in her hand, the small piece of metal catching the light as her fingers remained steady. And she watched the exchange, without stepping in, without interrupting, because something told her this was no longer about defending herself. It was about something larger, something she had not yet fully understood. And the man finally shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that drew attention back to him without effort. And when he spoke, his tone remained even, but there was a clarity to his words now, a precision that left little room for interpretation. "Order without fairness is not order," he said, and the sentence was not loud, not dramatic, but it landed with the kind of quiet certainty that made people listen differently, and a few of the guests exchanged glances, their expressions changing from passive observation to something closer to recognition, because even in a place built on appearances, truth had a way of cutting through when it was spoken plainly. And Richard opened his mouth to respond. But no words came immediately, his usual confidence interrupted by something he could not quite name. And the man took one small step closer, not invading space, not aggressive, just enough to shift the balance again. "Let me ask you something," he continued, his gaze steady. "If speaking up about something wrong is considered a violation here, what exactly are you protecting?" And the question did not demand an answer so much as it exposed the absence of one. And Richard's composure faltered again, his eyes flicking briefly toward the security guard, toward the staff at the front desk, as if looking for support that did not come, because no one moved, no one stepped in. The entire room suspended in that moment where authority was being quietly questioned. And Naomi felt it fully now. The weight of what was happening, the realization that her voice, the one she had used just minutes ago without knowing the consequences, had set something in motion that could not be undone. And yet she remained still, grounded, her posture unchanged, because for the first time in a long time, she was not shrinking, not retreating, not apologizing for existing in a space that expected her to be invisible. And the man turned his head slightly, just enough to take in the room, the guests, the staff, the carefully maintained image of perfection that surrounded them. And then his attention returned to Richard. "You said you maintain standards," he said, echoing the earlier statement with a tone that carried a different weight now. Standards should reveal integrity, not hide it. And the words settled into the silence with a finality that made it clear this was no longer a simple disagreement. It was a line being drawn, and Richard's expression tightened. The controlled confidence replaced by something more strained, something closer to realization, because the situation he thought he was managing had shifted into something he could not easily contain. And Naomi watched as that realization slowly took shape, not through raised voices or dramatic gestures, but through the steady, undeniable shift in power that came from someone who did not need to prove it, and the lobby, once a place of quiet luxury and predictable interactions, now felt like a stage where something far more significant was unfolding. Something that would not end with a simple apology or a quick dismissal, because the question had already been asked, and everyone in the room had heard it, and more importantly, everyone understood it. Richard Hale felt the silence press in on him from every direction, not loud, not chaotic, but controlled in a way that made it impossible to escape. And for a man who had built his authority on being the loudest voice in the room when necessary, the quiet now worked against him, stripping away the layers he usually relied on, leaving only the reality of the moment exposed. And he shifted his stance again, squaring his shoulders as if posture alone could restore control. "With all due respect," he said carefully, choosing each word like it might determine the outcome. "This is an internal matter, and I am responsible for maintaining discipline among my staff." And the emphasis on the word responsible carried an edge, an attempt to remind everyone listening that he still held a position, that he still had authority within these walls. But the man in front of him did not react to the assertion, did not challenge it directly, instead letting the statement sit there for a brief second before responding in a tone that remained steady, almost conversational, yet carried a quiet finality. "Responsibility without accountability is just control," he said. And the sentence did not echo, did not need to, because the meaning landed immediately, clear and undeniable. And a subtle shift moved through the room again, not visible but felt, like a collective understanding beginning to take shape among those watching. And Naomi stood still, her breathing even, her eyes no longer darting between faces but fixed, grounded, because something inside her had settled. Not relief, not yet, but a recognition that she was no longer alone in this moment. And Richard's jaw tightened as he processed the words, his gaze flicking once more around the lobby, taking in the audience he could no longer ignore, the guests who had stopped pretending not to watch, the staff who now stood still instead of moving. And he realized, perhaps for the first time, that whatever happened next would not stay contained within the usual boundaries of a routine dismissal. "Sir, I do not believe you understand the full context," Richard said, his voice lowering slightly as if trying to shift the conversation into something more controlled, more private. But the man did not step closer, did not lower his voice to match, instead keeping his tone exactly as it had been, consistent, measured. "Then explain it," he replied. And the simplicity of the response left no room for deflection, and Richard hesitated again, longer this time, because explanation required clarity, and clarity would expose details he had not intended to share. And in that hesitation, the balance tipped further, and Naomi saw it, not in dramatic fashion, but in the small, almost invisible changes. The way his confidence no longer filled the space the way it had before, the way his words now required effort instead of flowing naturally. And finally he spoke. An employee raised concerns about a situation she did not fully understand, he said, his tone sharpening slightly as he redirected the narrative, and instead of following proper channels. She chose to interrupt and challenge management in front of guests, which is unacceptable. And he nodded once, as if confirming his own reasoning, as if repeating it would make it stronger. And the man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his attention unwavering. And when Richard finished, there was a brief pause, not empty but deliberate, the kind that allowed the words to settle before they were addressed. And then the man turned his head slightly toward Naomi again, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence in the explanation. "Did you understand the situation?" he asked. And Naomi did not hesitate this time, her voice steady, clear. "I understood enough to know someone was being treated unfairly," she said, and there was no embellishment, no attempt to justify beyond that simple truth. And the man nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before looking back at Richard. So she understood the outcome, he said, even if she did not know every detail. And Richard's lips pressed together, frustration now visible beneath the surface, because the argument he had constructed was beginning to unravel under its own weight. And the man took a slow breath, not out of impatience, but out of control. maintaining the same calm presence that had defined every word so far. "Let me make something clear," he continued. And this time there was a subtle shift, not louder, not harsher, but more direct, more precise. In any place that claims to value professionalism, the ability to recognize and respond to unfairness is not a weakness. It is a standard. And the word standard carried new meaning now. Reshaped, redefined in a way that contrasted sharply with what had been said earlier, and the room seemed to absorb it. The tension no longer just about a single employee, but about something broader, something that touched everyone present. And Richard exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, as if he was trying to steady himself, trying to decide how to respond without losing what remained of his position. But before he could speak again, the man added one more sentence, quieter than the last, yet somehow more decisive. "And if your system cannot tell the difference," he said, "then the problem is not the person who spoke." And he did not finish the thought. Did not need to, because the implication was already clear. And in that moment, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was expectant, waiting for something that had not yet been said but was already understood. And Naomi stood there, her name tag still in her hand, the small piece of metal now feeling less like something she had lost and more like something she had outgrown. And for the first time since this began, she felt something steady rise beneath the pressure. Not confidence exactly, but something close to it, something that came from knowing that what she had done, what she had said, had not been wrong, no matter how the moment had started. Richard Hale could feel it now with unmistakable clarity. The moment slipping beyond his reach, not through confrontation, but through something far more difficult to counter. A steady dismantling of the narrative he had relied on, and for a man who had built his position on control, on structure, on the ability to define what was acceptable and what was not. The loss of that control did not come as a loud collapse, but as a quiet unraveling, thread by thread, word by word, and he inhaled slowly, forcing his expression back into something composed, something resembling the authority he had walked in with. "I believe this conversation has gone far enough," he said, his voice firmer now, attempting once more to close the situation, to draw a boundary that had already been crossed. "This is not up for public debate," and he gestured subtly toward the surrounding guests, as if reminding them of their role as observers, not participants. But the man in front of him did not acknowledge the attempt, did not shift his stance or his tone, instead letting the statement pass as if it carried no weight at all. And that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Richard, because ignoring authority was something he was not used to experiencing, especially in a space where he was supposed to define it. And the man's gaze moved briefly across the lobby, taking in the details with a calm precision. The polished surfaces, the carefully curated environment, the staff standing just a little too still, the guests pretending not to lean in, and then his attention returned, sharper now, more focused. "You are right about one thing," he said, his voice even, controlled. "This is not a debate." And there was a pause, just long enough for the words to settle before he continued. "This is a decision." And the shift in language was subtle but decisive, transforming the situation from something arguable into something final. And Richard felt it immediately, the difference, the way the room responded to that single change, because decisions implied authority, and authority, real authority, did not need to raise its voice. And for the first time since this began, Richard hesitated not because he lacked words, but because he was beginning to question whether those words still held power. "Sir, with respect, you are not in a position to make that decision," he said, choosing each word carefully, aware now that every sentence carried consequence, and the man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened just slightly, not anger, not irritation, but something closer to resolve, and he reached into the inside pocket of his suit with a calm, unhurried motion, the kind that drew attention precisely because it lacked urgency. And from it he produced a simple black card. No flourish, no display, just a quiet, deliberate gesture as he held it out between two fingers, and for a second, no one moved. Because the action itself did not explain anything. It simply introduced something new into the space, and Richard looked at it, confusion flickering across his face before he reached out, almost automatically, and took the card, his eyes dropping to read what was printed there, and in that instant, the color drained from his expression, not dramatically, not exaggerated, just enough to reveal the shift beneath the surface, the realization forming faster than he could hide it, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain or expectant. It was definitive, because whatever was written on that card had changed the entire context of the moment. And Naomi watched it happen without fully understanding yet. But she saw the difference. The way Richard's posture stiffened not out of confidence but out of recognition. The way his grip on the card tightened just slightly before he quickly composed himself. And when he looked back up, the certainty that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced by something far more cautious, far more aware. "Mr. Castellano," he said, the name coming out slower than intended, as if he was adjusting not just his tone, but his entire understanding of the situation. And the man, Dominic Castellano, did not nod, did not confirm. He simply allowed the recognition to settle because it was no longer necessary to state it out loud, and a ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, as a few of the staff exchanged glances, as the name reached ears that understood its weight, its implications, the authority it carried far beyond the walls of this building. And Naomi felt it too, not through reputation or recognition, but through the immediate, visible shift in everything around her. The way the tension realigned, the way the power dynamic that had seemed so fixed just minutes ago had now completely reversed. And Richard swallowed once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, before straightening again. This time not to assert dominance, but to regain composure in the presence of someone whose authority did not need to be explained. "I was not aware you were here today," he said, his voice carefully measured, stripped now of the earlier edge, replaced with something closer to formality, to caution, and Dominic's response was immediate, simple, and unchanged in tone. "You were not supposed to be," he said, and the sentence carried no accusation, no hostility, just a statement of fact that somehow made it more powerful, because it implied something larger, something beyond routine visits or casual oversight, and Richard nodded quickly, as if acknowledging more than just the words, as if understanding that whatever came next would not be handled the way he had intended. And the room remained silent, completely still, every person present aware now that the situation had crossed into something far beyond a standard termination, something that could not be undone or dismissed. And Naomi stood there, her name tag still in her hand. But now it felt different, no longer a symbol of something lost, but of something that had led her directly into this moment, a moment where the rules had changed, where the truth she had spoken had not only been heard, but had drawn the attention of someone who had the power to decide what happened next. And as Dominic Castellano looked between her and Richard, the stillness in the room deepened, not with uncertainty this time, but with the quiet certainty that whatever decision was about to be made would not be reversed. The name lingered in the air long after it had been spoken, not because it was loud, but because of what it carried, a weight that did not need explanation, and Richard Hale felt it settle into his chest like something heavy and unavoidable. His fingers still holding the black card, as if letting go of it too soon might undo whatever control he thought he still had left. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the silence had changed again, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but defined, structured by the presence of someone who did not need to prove anything. And Dominic Castellano let the stillness stretch just long enough before he moved, not stepping forward, not raising his voice, simply shifting his gaze from Richard to Naomi and back again, as if aligning the two ends of the situation in his mind. And when he finally spoke, his tone remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, calm, measured, unshaken. "Let us be clear about what just happened," he said. And the sentence did not invite interruption. It established direction. And Richard straightened instinctively, his posture now less about authority and more about attention, as if he understood that every word that followed would carry consequence beyond this moment. And Dominic continued. "An employee recognized something she believed was wrong," he said, his eyes briefly meeting Naomi's, not lingering, just acknowledging. She spoke, without raising her voice, without causing a scene, and she did so because she believed someone else was being treated unfairly, and each phrase was deliberate, precise, building not an argument but a record, a reconstruction of events that left little room for distortion. And Richard's jaw tightened slightly as he listened, because he could already see where this was going, even before it was said. And Dominic's attention shifted back to him. "And your response," he continued, "was to remove her immediately in public, as an example." And the final word carried a quiet emphasis, not accusatory, but unmistakable. And Richard opened his mouth as if to respond. But no words came immediately, because denial would require contradiction, and contradiction would require confidence he no longer possessed. And Dominic let the silence linger for half a second before finishing the thought. "Not because she was wrong," he said, "but because she spoke." And the simplicity of the conclusion made it impossible to challenge without unraveling everything that had been said before. And a faint shift moved through the room again. Not sound, not movement, just awareness. As the people watching began to understand not just what had happened, but how it had been reframed. And Naomi felt it fully now. The clarity of the situation no longer clouded by fear or uncertainty, but laid out in front of her in a way that made everything she had done feel grounded, justified. And for the first time since she had stepped into the lobby that day, she did not feel small, and Dominic's gaze remained on Richard, steady, unwavering. "You said you maintain standards," he repeated, echoing the earlier claim one final time. "Let me explain something about standards." And there was a subtle shift in his tone now, not louder, not harsher, but more defined, more final. "Standards are not about control," he said. "They are about what you allow, what you protect, and what you choose to ignore." And each phrase landed with quiet precision, shaping the meaning in a way that left no ambiguity. And Richard felt it, the words settling into the space he had once occupied so comfortably, now reshaped into something he could no longer manipulate. And Dominic took a small breath, maintaining the same calm presence that had defined every moment so far. "And what you allowed here," he continued, "was not professionalism, and there was no pause for reaction, no opening for interruption. It was silence, and the word carried a finality that closed the argument completely. And for a moment, the room held that silence, not as absence, but as acknowledgement, because everyone present understood what had just been said, and more importantly, what it meant. And Richard lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission, but in recognition, as if the truth of the moment had become too clear to ignore, And when he looked back up, his expression had changed again. Not fully defeated, but stripped of the certainty that had defined him earlier, replaced now by something more careful, more aware. "What would you like me to do?" he asked. And the question was quiet, controlled, but unmistakable in its implication, because it acknowledged a shift that could not be reversed. And Dominic did not answer immediately, not because he needed time, but because he understood the weight of what came next. And he let that weight settle fully into the room before responding, his voice steady, unwavering. "First," he said, "you are going to correct what you just did." And the instruction was simple, clear, leaving no room for interpretation. And the room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of fear, but out of anticipation, because whatever happened next would not just resolve the moment, it would define it. And Naomi stood there, her hand still holding the small metal name tag, but now it felt almost insignificant compared to everything else unfolding around her, because for the first time, the outcome was no longer being decided without her. It was being shaped in front of her, and the silence that followed Dominic's words was no longer uncertain or fragile. It was steady, grounded in the quiet certainty that justice, once set in motion, does not need to rush to arrive. The instructions settled into the room with a quiet finality that left no space for interpretation. And Richard Hale felt it immediately, the weight of it pressing against the last fragments of control he had tried to hold on to. And for a brief moment, he did not move, not because he did not understand, but because he did completely. And that understanding required a shift he had not anticipated when the day began. And his eyes moved slowly toward Naomi, who still stood where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that now felt impossible to ignore. And the lobby, once filled with subtle movement and quiet conversations, had become something else entirely, a space where every detail felt sharper, every second more defined. And Richard took a breath, measured, controlled, before stepping forward, the sound of his polished shoes against the marble echoing just enough to mark the shift in direction. And when he stopped in front of her, there was a pause. Not long, but noticeable, as if the moment itself required acknowledgement before it could continue. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, not defiant, not challenging, simply present. And for the first time since he had spoken those dismissive words earlier, Richard did not look through her, did not reduce her to a role or a title. He looked at her directly, and that alone changed something in the air, subtle but undeniable. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier sharpness, carrying a formality that had not been there before. And a few of the staff nearby shifted slightly, as if adjusting to a reality they had not expected to witness. And Richard continued, choosing his words carefully. "Your termination is being rescinded, effective immediately." And the sentence was clear, direct, leaving no room for misinterpretation. And for a moment, the words seemed to hang there, not because they were unclear, but because of what they represented. A complete reversal of what had been declared just minutes ago. And Naomi felt it, the shift, the change in direction. But she did not react outwardly, did not step forward or speak immediately, because something inside her understood that this was not just about being given back a position, it was about something deeper, something that could not be restored with a single sentence. And Richard paused again, as if sensing that, before adding, "Additionally, I will personally review the situation that led to your concern." And the phrasing was careful, controlled, an attempt to regain some structure within the new reality. And a faint murmur moved through the room, not loud, but present, as the guests and staff absorbed the outcome, the reversal, the acknowledgement that what had been declared as final was now undone. And Dominic Castellano remained where he stood, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable, but his presence continued to define the moment, not through action, but through the quiet authority that had shaped everything so far. And Naomi finally lowered her gaze for a brief second, looking at the name tag still in her hand, the small piece of metal that had marked the end of something only minutes ago, and now, in this moment, seemed to carry a different meaning entirely. And when she looked back up, her eyes were steady, grounded, and she spoke, her voice calm, measured. "I appreciate the correction," she said, and the words were simple, respectful, but they did not carry relief. They did not carry gratitude in the way Richard might have expected, and that difference did not go unnoticed. And he nodded once, quickly, as if acknowledging the response, before stepping back slightly, creating space that had not existed before, and the room seemed to exhale, not dramatically, but subtly, as the immediate tension began to settle into something more stable, something that could be processed rather than endured. And a few of the staff resumed small movements, adjusting papers, shifting positions, but their attention remained anchored to the center of the lobby, to the moment that had just unfolded. And Naomi stood there, no longer the focus of judgment, no longer the subject of dismissal, but something else entirely, something that had emerged through the situation rather than been defined by it. And Dominic's gaze moved to her again, briefly, not evaluating, not questioning, simply acknowledging. And then back to Richard. And the message in that silent exchange was clear. This was not the end. Not fully, not yet, because correction was only the first step, and the weight of what had been revealed, what had been exposed, still lingered in the space between them. And as the silence settled once more, it was no longer uncertain or tense. It was defined, grounded in the quiet understanding that something had shifted, not just for Naomi, but for everyone who had witnessed it. And that shift would not be undone by a single reversal, no matter how immediate it had been. The words had been spoken, the correction made, and yet something remained, something unaddressed that lingered beneath the surface of the polished floor and quiet air. Because restoration alone did not erase what had already been revealed. And Dominic Castellano understood that in a way that did not require explanation. His gaze steady as it moved once more across the room, taking in the subtle shifts that had begun to ripple through the staff, the way people now stood a little straighter, the way their attention carried a different kind of awareness, as if the invisible rules they had followed without question had just been exposed under a different light. And he stepped forward slightly, not toward Naomi this time, but toward the center of the space, positioning himself where his voice could carry without effort, without force. "That is the correction," he said, his tone even controlled. "But it is not the lesson," and the distinction settled immediately, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot back into focus, because it suggested something unfinished, something still unfolding, and Richard Hale remained still, his posture composed but no longer dominant. His role in the moment shifted from authority to witness. And Dominic continued, "A place like this," he said, his eyes moving briefly toward the surrounding architecture. The marble, the glass, the carefully curated elegance relies on more than appearance. And the statement was simple, almost obvious. But in this moment, it carried weight, because it reframed what the room itself represented. "It relies on people," he added, and his gaze moved toward the staff, not just Naomi, but all of them, the ones who had stood still, who had watched, who had learned without speaking, and a subtle shift moved through them, a recognition that they were now part of something larger than the routine of their roles. And Naomi felt it too. The widening of the moment beyond her own experience, beyond the confrontation that had brought her here. and Dominic's attention returned to Richard. "When someone speaks up," he said, "you have two choices, and there was no pause for interruption, no space for denial. You can ask why, or you can silence them." And the simplicity of the statement carried more impact than any accusation could have, because it reduced the situation to something undeniable, something that could not be reframed without losing its truth. And Richard lowered his gaze briefly again, not out of defeat, but out of acknowledgement, as if the clarity of the moment had stripped away the ability to argue, and Dominic took a slow breath, maintaining the same calm control that had defined every word so far. "You chose the second," he said, not harshly, not with anger, but with certainty. And the words settled into the space between them, marking the moment not as a mistake, but as a decision that had been made and now understood, and the room remained silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been laid out with precision. And Naomi stood there, no longer at the center of conflict, but at the center of something else, something that felt less like confrontation and more like recognition. And Dominic turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers again, and this time it lingered just a fraction longer, enough to acknowledge not just her presence, but her choice, the decision she had made when it would have been easier to remain silent. And when he spoke again, his voice softened slightly, not losing its authority, but carrying a different tone, one that recognized something beyond the immediate moment. "You did not make a mistake," he said, and the words were direct, unambiguous, and Naomi felt them land in a way that nothing else had so far, because they did not restore a position. They affirmed a decision, and for a brief second, her composure shifted, not outwardly, not visibly to most, but internally, where the weight of the past few minutes had begun to settle into something steadier, something more grounded. And Dominic's gaze moved back to the room, to the staff, to the system that had allowed the moment to unfold the way it had. "If speaking up is treated as a problem," he continued, "then the real problem is what you are protecting." And the sentence echoed the earlier question, but now it carried resolution instead of inquiry, and the staff absorbed it, not as a directive, but as a standard, something that would linger beyond the moment, beyond the presence of the man who had spoken it. And Richard exhaled slowly, the sound quiet, controlled, as if releasing the last of the tension he had been holding. And when he looked up again, his expression was different, not defensive, not assertive, but aware of the shift that had taken place. Aware of the responsibility that now carried a different meaning. And Dominic took one final look around the lobby, his presence still defining the space, but no longer pressing against it, because what needed to happen had already begun. And as the silence settled once more, it was no longer heavy or uncertain. It was clear, grounded in the understanding that what had been revealed here would not simply fade when the moment ended, because the lesson had been spoken, and more importantly, it had been heard. The lobby did not return to normal right away, and perhaps it never truly would, because moments like this did not simply pass. They settled into the walls, into the memory of the people who witnessed them, reshaping the way silence would be understood from that point forward. And Naomi Carter stood there for a second longer than necessary, not because she did not know what to do, but because she felt the weight of what had just happened finally begin to shift into something she could carry, something that no longer pressed down on her, but lifted her just enough to stand differently. And she slowly reached up, her fingers steady as she reattached the small metal name tag to her uniform. The click soft but distinct in the quiet room, and that simple motion carried more meaning now than it had earlier. Not as a return to what was, but as a step into something new, and around her, The staff resumed their roles, but not in the same way, their movements more deliberate. Their awareness sharper, as if each of them had just been reminded that their presence mattered in ways that extended beyond routine. And Richard Hale stepped back toward the front desk, his posture composed but undeniably changed, his eyes no longer scanning for control but for understanding, and he paused for a brief second, looking once more in Naomi's direction, not with authority, not with dismissal, but with a quiet acknowledgement that required no words. And then he turned, already beginning to move differently within the space he had once dominated so easily. And Dominic Castellano remained where he was for a moment longer, his presence still and grounded, as if ensuring that what had been set in motion would not unravel the moment he stepped away. And then, without announcement, without drawing attention, he adjusted the cuff of his suit and turned toward the exit. His footsteps measured, unhurried, each one echoing softly against the marble as the room instinctively parted around him, not out of fear, but out of respect for something they had just witnessed, something they now understood. And Naomi watched him go, not fully aware of everything his presence represented, but fully aware of what it had changed. And just before he reached the door, he paused, not turning back completely, just enough for his voice to carry across the distance without needing to rise. "Do not lose that," he said, and the words were simple, almost quiet, but they reached her clearly, and Naomi understood immediately that he was not speaking about the name tag, not about the job, but about the choice she had made when it would have been easier to stay silent. And she nodded once, a small, steady motion that carried more certainty than anything she had felt earlier that day. And Dominic did not wait for a response, did not linger for acknowledgement. He simply continued forward, stepping through the glass doors and into the daylight beyond. And as the doors closed behind him, the lobby exhaled, the tension dissolving not into forgetfulness, but into something quieter, something more lasting. And Naomi took a breath, deep and steady, her shoulders settling into a posture that no longer carried the weight of doubt. And she turned back toward her cart, toward her work. But this time, the movement was different, not automatic, not diminished, but intentional, as if every step now carried awareness of what she was worth. And the people around her noticed it, not in a dramatic way, but in the small details, the way she moved, the way she held her head, the way she no longer seemed invisible within the space that had once reduced her to silence. And the day continued, the routine resumed, but nothing felt exactly the same, because something had shifted beneath the surface, something that would not easily return to what it had been. And as the sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long reflections across the polished floor, the room held onto that shift, quietly, steadily, as a reminder that dignity did not depend on permission, and that sometimes all it took to change everything was a single voice refusing to stay silent. And that day, without spectacle, without noise, the room had learned what that looked like,